Happy Sunday, everyone. Here it is, day number 3, the 25-day Wife Life Live experience. I'm your girl, Sharnetta J. Harrell, social worker by day, founder of Sisters in Crisis Kingdom, and your favorite online wife life resource empowering you to peel back your layers one day at a time. So, I just want to tell you a little bit about the topic for today. Each day for the next 22 days, the hope is that each experience empowers you to think about your own personal experiences through my personal experiences, right? I want this to be interactive. I want this to be a transparent experience for you, and I want it to be relatable, right? So today's topic is one that I think that we all kind of know and that we all kind of have probably heard of, right? So today's topic is a childhood memory. What goes on in the house stays in the house, right? How many of us can identify with this? How many of us can say that, our mom, our dad, our grandma, or, anybody, what does that mean to you, right? So the reason why I wanted to talk a little bit about what goes on in the house stays in this house, right? How many of us have heard that before, right? So if you're anything like me, that was something that was definitely preached to me, right? So I grew up in a single parent household, I'm very open about sharing. My mom is very open about sharing, but, I grew up in a very single parent household, along with my grandmother. And, my mom, definitely, has had a lot of transitions in her life. And so my mom would always tell me, what goes on in the house stays in this house, right? Girl, you don't need to be going, telling your friends and telling other people about, what goes on in her house, right? So I respected that. But what becomes dangerous about that childhood memory, and, speaking for myself and speaking for a lot of women, right? What becomes dangerous in that is when there are things that happen to us or things that we experience that we are not talking about. Inevitably, these are things that ultimately affect our marriage, right? So, for example, today, if you look at your marriage and you look at some of the things that, some of the things that cause friction or some of the things that cause conflict, right? Some of these things may be a direct result of your childhood memory of what goes on in the house stays in the house, right? So when we really begin to peel back our layers on a lot of things that we have experienced, I really want to empower you and encourage you to think about what happened in your house that stayed in the house and what happened that, you were not able to talk about or you haven't talked about, right? So before I go any further, I want to welcome you. I want to welcome you, and I certainly want to thank you for tuning in, and supporting the 25-day Wife Life Live experience. As always, on September the 25th, I will be launching something very big. And so the 25-day Wife Life Live experience is an opportunity for you to get to know me and my experiences and for you to be empowered to share your own. So I'm very excited about that. So moving right along, as always, as questions, tune in. Anything that you would like, to talk about, I'm your girl, right? So the difference between the dangerous thing about the childhood memory of, what goes on in the house stays in this house is, the difference between secrecy and sacredcy, right? And so, for my husband and I think there are a lot, marriage itself is sacred, right? It's a sacred thing, just like intimacy and all these other things, right? But the dangerous part is when you cannot identify the difference between secrets and things that are sacred, right? So, when we talk about what goes on in this house stays in this house, sometimes, when we think about that, and that statement and that childhood memory may mean different things for different people, right? And so some of the women, some of my friends, that, we've talked about this is, that we talked about this statement with is, that might mean experiencing molestation. That may mean experiencing or witnessing domestic violence in your home. That may mean, witnessing, your mom, passed out on the couch for drinking alcohol. That may mean, incest. That may mean financial hardship. That might mean, just a lot of things going on in your home, and, you guys are going to church on Sundays and pretending like everything is okay. So when we talk about the childhood memory of what goes on in the house stays in that house, right? Really begin to open up with your spouse about some of the things that you experienced related to that childhood memory, right? So, I think that, us as women, right, we do a lot of, putting on a good face, putting on a good front, when really, our house is a mess. Right? And so what I really want you to do is I really want you to peel back those layers. I really want you to peel back those layers to see what were some of the areas in your childhood memories when it came to the statement of what goes on in the house stays in the house. What did that look like for you, and what were those experiences? Okay? So moving right along, when I was talking with my husband about today's topic of this childhood memory, he broke it down very clearly for me, and he said, that's unhealthy, right? It's unhealthy to kind of have that, perspective, on your marriage and, people who are ultimately affected by that childhood memory, right? What goes on in the house stays in the house, right? That is an unhealthy statement. And I think going back to the differences between, sacredcy and secrets, I think that is ultimately how things begin to fester, and that's how things begin to really manifest themselves, right? And so as we grow older and as we mature and as we, become married women, we have to ultimately know how to address these things and how to, ultimately process these things too. Of course, I am a social worker, and, I used to do community mental health. And so, of course, I always advocate for therapy. If there are things that you experienced in your childhood, that were anything related to, abuse, neglect, abandonment, or any of those things, I encourage you to go seek out some professional help, and really, seek out some additional supports that will allow you to process that differently. Okay, so moving right along, really begin to ask yourself and ask your spouse the childhood memory of what goes on in the house stays in the house. Talk to your husband about that, ladies. What did your husband experience growing up? What did your husband experience and witness? What did your husband, why was your husband told that? These are all of the things. We have to know our husband's history, ladies. Whenever we get in a relationship, just like a friendship, when we get into a friendship, we want to know the history of them. We want to get to know them. We want to see how their behaviors and how all of these different character traits happen, right? It's the same thing with marriage. In our marriage, we have to get to know the history of our spouse. So, you might be wondering, well, why your husband doesn't go to church on Sundays, right? Well, what goes on in the house stays in the house. Maybe, your husband, grew up seeing, your mom and dad fight on Saturday nights, and they never made it to church on Sunday morning, right? So that might be his reluctance to going to church on Sundays. Maybe your husband, has some social issues, and he might have some social anxiety. Well, if going back to the childhood memory, if he was, constantly bullied and that was not something that was addressed in his home, then he might have some anxiousness about, going out socially. If your husband is struggling in his health, if he's struggling, with weight, he might have been criticized about his weight by his parents or in the house or by his siblings. So we really have to begin not only peeling back our own layers, ladies, but also kind of peeling back the layers of our spouse too, right? And so, I always laugh with my husband because whenever we're in deep conversation or having some good content and dialogue, he always reminds me of my statement of peeling back those layers, right? And sometimes he even says, babe, can you help me to peel back my layers, right? And that's not always, peeling back the layers is not always a deep, statement. Sometimes that can be with practical things of life, right? So, if something is happening, on my husband's job, and he says, well, babe, this really bothers me. And he says, can you help me, peel back my layers a little bit? Definitely, babe. What's up? What's going on? What is it about this person that bothers you? Does that remind you of something that, you experienced in your childhood? And the reality of it is, talking about our childhood experiences is hard. It's hard. Nobody wants to do it. And the reality of it is we are all a mess. Regardless of how much money you make, regardless of what your parents do, regardless of what you do, regardless of what neighborhood you grew up in, regardless of how many times you went to church a week, we are all a mess, right? And we all have issues, and we all have things that occurred in our childhood that we probably have not really addressed, right? So when we think about a childhood memory, what goes on in the house stays in the house. Number one, how do you feel when you hear that statement? Number two, how are you going to address that statement? And number three, how did it ultimately affect you? How does it affect you today, right? How does it affect your marriage? How does that statement ultimately affect you guys as a couple and you guys as a unit, right? Because you are a unit. You're one, right? So one of the other things that I really kind of wanted to address, and I really wanted to kind of touch on with this is, I think even when we talk about, what goes on in the house stays in this house, I think that can also be a cultural piece as well for the African American community. I think that, I was reading an article about, it was just very research based, and it was an article on, the single Black female. And it just really talked about how, African American women are naturally, they naturally become, these hardworking women, because they don't really have a choice, because, a man left, and so they have to clean up that mess, and they have to, be these strong pillars of the community and in their homes. And what I really want to challenge you ladies is, because I know that all of you all come from all different backgrounds and all different cultures and all different experiences, but, I really want to challenge you to know your mom's history, right? What were some of the things that your mom experienced as a child? So sometimes it's not just enough to peel back our own layers and to see where we come from, but, really, talk to your mom. Talk to your mom about what did she experience growing up as well. What were some of the things that your mom experienced as a child? What were some of the things that, I can even say for my own self, I talk to my mom all the time because she has been in a lot of transitions, from a male perspective, from a male standpoint, from being divorced more than once. And so I always kind of try to tap in with her and try to see, as a child, what were some of the things that she experienced that, may have contributed to her overall outcome in her previous marriages, right? And then to take it a step further, my grandmother, taking a step further, my grandmother is no longer here. She is in heaven, but, if I had the opportunity, I would want to ask my grandmother, what were some of the things that she experienced as a child as well, right? And so one of the things that, our pastor talked about today was daddy issues. And one of the things that really stood out to me was, and when he said it is unbiblical to, continue to relive generational curses. And, I, made up in my mind a long time ago that I would not continue to live those generational curses and experiences, right? But I will address them. And I think that, when we can't not, we can't stop a generational curse if we don't know what it is, or if we're not addressing it, or if we're not processing it, right? And then once we do address it and process it, we can't stay there. We have to move on. And so one of the things that I want you guys to be able to do is that I want you guys to think about that childhood memory. Think about what happened, you know, even if it wasn't verbally said to you. What goes on in the house stays in the house. Think about how your parents, how your mother and father, how your mother, how your father, how your grandmother, how your aunts, how your uncles, how your siblings, how did they handle conflict in the home? And what were your experiences in your home as a child? Right? I want you to think about that today. I want you to think about that. It might be hard, right? But the reality of it is we all have something. We all have a testimony. We all have experiences that we have lived through. And, you know, God is so good because, you know, he gives us and he extends, you know, mercy, love, grace, and compassion. And so we don't have to stay there, right? But we can address it. So, I am past my 15 minutes. You know, I'm trying to stick to my 15-minute limit so I don't talk you guys to death over the next 22 days. But again, I just want to thank everyone for tuning in. For everyone who joined, I want to say a hello and thank you so much. It's Sunday. It is Labor Day weekend. I am sitting on the couch with my husband, and we are just going to enjoy the day, just going to enjoy the weather and just enjoy each other, and really just do some reflection and just chill, right? Just chill. We don't have any special plans. You know, we're not going out of town. We are going to chill. And so from one experience to another, I want to empower you and encourage you to think about that experience, okay? Think about your childhood memories. Think about, you know, the statement, if you ever heard it, what goes on in the house stays in this house, and think about how it has ultimately affected your marriage, whether negatively or positively, okay? As always, I am Shanetta J. Harrell. I am an online wife life resource, and I am empowering you to peel back your layers one day at a time. You can find me in my blog and website at www.ShanettaJHarrell.com. You can also head over to Instagram and plug me in to Shanetta J. Harrell, and there you will find my blog. You will find more information and meetup groups about Sisters in Crisis Kingdom Sick, Calling Sick. You can also find Twitter, my Instagram, and my Facebook there. Okay. All right, ladies, as always, I cannot promise you the live time for tomorrow, but I can certainly promise you that it will be there and it will be on my YouTube channel. You can head over to my YouTube channel and find me there at Shanetta Harrell. All righty. Until next time, thank you so much for joining, and I can't wait till tomorrow for day 4. Have a great Sunday.